Have you ever felt like you studied incredibly hard for something, like maybe a massive college exam or prepping for a huge presentation at work, only to realize a week later that you didn't actually retain any of it?
Yeah, you cram all that data in, you pass the test or survive the meeting, but the knowledge just sort of evaporates.
Exactly, it just vanishes. Well, welcome to another deep dive. Today we are cracking the code on how to physically and mentally build critical thinking skills.
And we aren't just talking about abstract, fluffy theories here.
No, not at all. We are looking at what is essentially a literal instruction manual for the brain.
We are drawing heavily today from the insights of Professor Pierluigi Piazzi, specifically his work on teaching intelligence. And what makes his approach so compelling is that it fundamentally dismantles this idea that intelligence is just some genetic lottery.
Right, like you either win or lose at birth.
Exactly. He treats intelligence as a structure. It is something you can actively, deliberately construct using very specific, practical methods.
Which is such a relief to hear, honestly. And I want to jump right into a story Piazzi shares that totally reframes this whole concept.
Right.
He talks about a student, Paula, from Salvador.
Oh, yeah. The classic straight-A student.
Right. She was the one who always had perfectly color-coded notes. She sat in the front row and just seemed to breeze through her classes. But when she tried to get into a highly competitive university program, she failed the entrance exams.
And she didn't just fail once.
No, she kept failing year after year.
Which highlights a remarkably common paradox, don't you think? You have a straight-A student who suddenly hits a brick wall the moment the challenge shifts from mere memorization to actual critical application.
It really forces us to ask what the traditional school system is actually measuring.
Yeah, I mean, it's mostly measuring compliance and short-term recall.
Exactly.
True.
And that was her massive aha moment. After another crushing rejection, she stumbled upon Piazzi's methods and realized this terrifying truth. She had been studying wrong her entire life.
She was a master at getting good grades, but she had never actually learned how to be intelligent.
Because her routine was entirely passive. She would listen to lectures, highlight text, reread her notes. It felt like hard work. But cognitively, she wasn't building any new pathways.
And once she changed her daily habits based on the practical methods we are about to break down, everything shifted for her.
So let's get into those methods. Paula's revelation brings us to the first major hurdle most of us face, which is the myth of passive learning.
Right. Piazzi illustrates this with a brilliant and honestly quite stark graph that contrasts two different environments. On one axis, you have time spent in a classroom or a meeting.
And on the other, you have time spent in what he calls solitary study.
Yeah. The graph maps out the percentage of actual doing, like the real cognitive effort.
And looking at the classroom side of the graph, the percentage of doing is just incredibly low.
It's almost zero.
Yeah, you're just sitting there. You might be taking a few notes or nodding along as the teacher or the boss speaks. It feels productive because you are physically present and awake. But cognitively, your brain is basically in low power mode.
The real method for developing critical thinking happens entirely during active, solitary study. Piazzi represents this growth in intelligence mathematically, framing it as the function y equals f of x plus 1.
Let's break that down, because I know math equations on an audio deep dive can be tough.
Yeah.
But it's not just an arbitrary equation.
No, it's very intentional. The f of x represents your baseline. It is who you are and what you know right now without any extra effort.
So if I'm just reading a book or sitting in a lecture, I'm basically just riding along my baseline.
Exactly.
I'm taking in data, but I'm not really stretching the capacity of the container holding that data.
That's a great way to put it. The plus one in the equation represents a unit of active, solitary struggle. It represents that continuous push beyond your current baseline.
Because during a lecture, you are merely receiving information.
Right, and reception is not comprehension.
Comprehension only happens when you are alone, the lecture is over, the book is closed, and you are wrestling with the material, forcing your brain to reconstruct it from scratch.
So what does this actually look like for you listening right now? If you want to build critical thinking for your next big project, you cannot rely on passively consuming information.
You can't just watch a tutorial on YouTube and expect your brain to upgrade its operating system.
You have to isolate yourself.
Yeah, take a blank piece of paper and try to map out the concept from memory. You have to actively fight with the ideas.
And that deliberate friction is what trains the brain to look deeper into the architecture of reality. Which leads us to one of the most striking visual metaphors Piazzi uses to separate an actively trained brain from a passively conditioned one.
Oh, here's where it gets really interesting.
I love this part.
So Piazzi uses this progression of images featuring the Linux mascot, the penguin. First, you see a standard computer screen with a simple folder.
A very familiar sight.
Right. Inside that folder is an image file named penguin.bmemp. You double-click it, and you see exactly what you'd expect, a cute, regular image of a cartoon penguin.
And that is how most of us view the world on a daily basis.
Yeah, we see the neat, packaged image presented to us by a news anchor or a politician or a marketing team.
But the progression takes a fascinating turn. It shows what happens when you open that exact same image file, not in a standard picture viewer, but in a raw text editor, like Notepad.
It is pure chaos.
Total gibberish.
It's just a massive wall of raw code, symbols, weird letters. But that gibberish is the underlying data that tells the computer how to render the penguin on your screen.
And a core practical method for building intelligence is actively training your brain to see that raw code behind everyday information.
When a poor critical thinker reads a news article or looks at a business report, they just see the penguin.
Right, they accept the neat little picture the author painted for them. They don't question the colors or the shape.
But when you actively train your intelligence, through that solitary struggle we just talked about, you start looking for the Notepad version of reality.
You stop asking, what is this picture? And you start asking, what are the raw assumptions making up this picture?
Yeah. If a colleague hands you a proposal at work, seeing the raw code means looking past the slick PowerPoint slides.
It means asking, where did they get this data?
Exactly. What timeline are they assuming? Who benefits financially if we adopt this strategy? What variables are they conveniently leaving out?
The next time someone hands you a neatly packaged conclusion, you have to force your brain to open it in Notepad.
And we use the phrase force your brain quite literally here, because Piazzi emphasizes that this isn't just a software update. This is about physically rewiring the hardware of your mind.
He dives really deep into the biological and technical realities of this process. He places biological diagrams of human neurons, complete with dendrites, axons, and myelin sheaths, right alongside technical diagrams of digital logic gates processing zeros and ones.
Wait, let's slow down here, because jumping from brain biology to digital logic gates, it's a pretty massive leap.
It is, yeah.
How does translating abstract mathematical concepts physically change the fat around my brain cells?
It's a crucial connection to make. Let's look at the biology first. When you learn something passively, like when Paula from Salvador was just rereading her notes, the electrical signal firing in your brain is incredibly weak.
It barely registers.
Right, but every time you force your brain to solve a complex problem, like sitting alone and wrestling with a concept until you truly understand it, you send a massive, strong electrical signal down the axon of the neuron.
And this intense physical effort signals your body's glial cells to wrap that specific axon in a fatty substance called the myelin sheath.
Exactly.
So the myelin acts like insulation on a copper wire. It stops the electrical signal from leaking out, making it travel vastly faster and more efficiently.
The more you struggle to think critically, the thicker the myelin gets. You literally become naturally faster and more intelligent at processing complex information.
But to trigger that myelination, the input has to cross a specific threshold of difficulty. Your brain won't waste energy building myelin for easy, passive tasks.
And this brings us to the logic diagrams Piazzi uses, showing inputs of zeros and ones.
He actually shows images of Excel functions, specifically the IF function, right alongside these complex binary and hexadecimal calculators.
I know it seems incredibly intimidating at first glance.
Yeah, why is he asking us to look at spreadsheet formulas and binary code to build critical thinking?
Because explicitly practicing conditional logic is the ultimate workout for crossing those neural thresholds. The Excel IF function is the perfect practical framework.
If condition X is met, then outcome Y is true, otherwise outcome Z happens.
Right. When you force yourself to break down messy real-world problems into these strict, emotionless, logical pathways, you are physically exercising and myelinating those specific neural circuits.
I want to give a really concrete example of this for you listening, because this is an amazing tool.
Go for it.
Let's say you are managing a project at work, and everyone's panicking because the budget might get slashed. A poor critical thinker just panics and worries about the ambiguous threat.
The sky's falling.
Right. But if you apply Piazzi's method, you strip away the emotion and write it out literally like an Excel formula. If the marketing budget is cut by 10%, then we shift our focus to organic social media Otherwise, we proceed with the current paid ad campaign.
You force the ambiguous anxiety into a binary, manageable structure.
By doing that, you aren't just solving the immediate work problem. You are actively training your brain's hardware.
Piazzi also emphasizes translating information across different formats to create this friction. For example, looking at the standard decimal number 5 and forcing your brain to understand it as the binary code 101.
You're taking a concept, automatically and forcing it through a completely new, unfamiliar logical pathway.
And that deliberate friction is what signals the brain to lay down more myelin.
As that myelin thickens and those logic centers become hyper-efficient, you start to develop what Piazzi considers a master skill for critical thinking, advanced pattern recognition.
Throughout his work, there are these recurring visual grids. Some have changing stars, others have squares moving around, or circles with different shading patterns inside them.
The goal is to figure out what the next image in the sequence is. They look exactly like those abstract IQ tests you see online.
They do, yeah.
I get how solving a puzzle is a fun mental workout, but how does identifying moving squares on a grid actually translate to me avoiding a disaster at work or making better life decisions?
Well, Piazzi connects this to a really powerful historical metaphor, the Titanic. He lays out 3 distinct scenarios for a ship at sea.
Okay, scenario 1, the ship hits the iceberg head-on. Absolute disaster.
Right. Scenario 2, the ship has already hit the iceberg, water is pouring in, and you see sailors desperately spinning a wheel to close the watertight doors.
They are just trying to isolate the flooding and do damage control. They are reacting to a failure that has already occurred.
Exactly. And then there is the third scenario. A ship calmly and safely navigating its way between the icebergs, avoiding the danger entirely.
So developing your pattern recognition through those abstract puzzles acts as your cognitive radar.
Yes. Poor critical thinkers are the sailors desperately closing the watertight doors. They don't see the logical fallacies, the bad data, or the toxic relationship until the disaster has already happened.
Then they spend all their energy doing damage control.
But strong critical thinkers, the ones who have trained their pattern recognition by looking for the notepad code, by doing the solitary study, by practicing if-then logic, they spot the logical fallacies early.
They see the icebergs a mile away and simply steer the ship around them.
If you feel like you are constantly putting out fires in your personal or professional life, it might be because your cognitive radar isn't picking up the subtle patterns leading up to the disaster.
Building that radar requires serious effort. But Piazzi issues a massive warning here. None of these practical exercises will work if your underlying motivation is wrong.
The environment of intelligence is just as critical as the exercises themselves.
We have to talk about the creepy clown illustration.
It is genuinely unsettling.
Very. Piazzi includes a drawing of this grinning, slightly sinister clown, dressed as a teacher, standing next to a chalkboard. And written on the board is the phrase, "Do the homework and get a grade."
It is a harsh critique of traditional education and corporate training. A major roadblock to developing true critical thinking is relying on extrinsic motivation.
If your only goal is to get the grade, or pass the HR compliance test, or just impress your boss in a meeting, your brain treats that information as highly temporary.
Once the external reward or threat is gone, your brain literally discards the data to save energy.
It's the cramming phenomenon we talked about at the very beginning. You memorize the answers for the test, the clown gives you your A, and your brain immediately hits the delete button because the threat is gone.
To actually build permanent intelligence, you must shift from extrinsic motivation to deep intrinsic comprehension. You have to de-gamify your learning.
Stop treating knowledge as points to be collected on a rubric and start treating it as a set of tools you are acquiring to understand the universe.
You have to genuinely want to know the why and the how, not just memorize the what.
And speaking of the physical realities of the brain, Piazzi makes it clear that you can have all the intrinsic motivation in the world and do all the solitary study imaginable, but if you ignore your basic biology, the entire system crashes.
He pairs an image of a girl reading a book right next to a massive illustration of a biological circadian clock.
If we connect this back to the biology of neurons and myelin we discussed earlier, the consolidation of memory, the actual physical reinforcing of those neural pathways, happens almost entirely during sleep.
Right. Piazzi emphasizes the circadian rhythm to state a non-negotiable biological rule of the hardware.
All these active study methods, the neural rewiring, the pattern recognition workouts, they are physically impossible to consolidate if you are consistently sleep deprived.
Aligning your intense cognitive workouts with proper structured sleep cycles isn't a luxury. It is a fundamental requirement for the physical growth of intelligence.
You cannot cheat the hardware.
No, you really can't.
It reminds me of how Piazzi brings up the classic historical framework of the seven liberal arts, specifically the trivium and the quadrivium.
He takes this brief detour into ancient history because those ancient scholars respected the foundational rules of reality in the exact same way.
The trivium consisted of grammar, logic, and rhetoric, and the quadrivium covered arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy.
Piazzi uses this to show that true critical thinking relies on a foundation of diverse, rigorous disciplines built in a very specific order.
Which connects directly back to our notepad raw code metaphor. Grammar is learning that the code exists.
Logic is understanding the rules of how the code actually works and interacts.
And rhetoric is finally learning how to write your own code and communicate it to others.
Traditional modern education often skips straight to rhetoric. We teach people how to argue and debate before we teach them the fundamental logic in math.
The actual structure of reality.
Exactly. Piazzi's methods are about returning to that robust, multidisciplinary framework to evaluate the world. You learn the structure first, then you learn how to manipulate it.
Let's bring all of this together. We've covered a massive amount of ground today, looking at the literal instruction manual for the brain. Let's distill this into rapid-fire, actionable takeaways for you to start building your own intelligence today, right after this deep dive ends.
Sounds good. First, remember the baseline graph. You have to isolate yourself for solitary, active study.
You have to put in the reps alone. Passive listening, even to a deep dive like this, is just the beginning. The real muscle is built when you turn this off and try to apply it.
Second, practically train your neural thresholds by practicing if-then logic in your daily life. Take a stressful, ambiguous problem and break it down into strict, conditional statements. Strip away the emotion and map out the binary choices.
Third, always look for the Linux Notepad raw code. Don't accept the neat picture presented to you. Dig into the raw data, the funding, and the underlying assumptions.
Fourth, actively train your pattern recognition. Do the logic puzzles, read dense material, and build your cognitive radar so you can steer the ship around the icebergs instead of always playing damage control.
And finally, stop learning just to get the grade from the creepy clown. Shift your motivation to deep comprehension and guard your sleep cycle like your intelligence depends on it, because biologically it does.
What is truly empowering about Piazzi's framework is how it completely demystifies intelligence. It takes it from being this magical, intangible gift that some people have and some people don't, and reveals it to be a literal muscle.
It's biological, it's structural, and most importantly, it's a process you have absolute agency over.
Being smart isn't an identity, it's an action. It's the result of doing the hard thing over and over.
Which brings us to a final thought I want to leave you with today. We've seen that intelligence physically grows through the friction of solitary struggle, through hitting those cognitive thresholds and forcing the myelin to wrap those nerves.
So you have to ask yourself, in an age where your phone can instantly answer any question for you with zero effort, what mental muscles are you accidentally allowing to atrophy simply because you are avoiding the struggle?
When we outsource the friction of thinking to a device, we are outsourcing the very process that builds our cognitive capacity.
Without the struggle, there is no +1 to our baseline.
It is definitely something to mull over the next time you reach for a search engine instead of wrestling with a problem for just 5 more minutes. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep wrestling with the hard concepts, keep building those pathways, and as always, keep questioning the world around you.